and welcome to our all-important pre-budget series, Mapping the Stimulus. This budget comes in the wake of an unprecedented currency swap or demonetization that has pained some sections and probably slowed an already sluggish economic recovery. It also comes ahead of the country moving to a single goods and services tax across all states. So the questions we are asking in this series is, should the fisc stimulate the economy? Does it need stimulus? 2, how and how much can it stimulate the economy, considering that the GST Council will soon take charge of half the taxes, that is the indirect taxes. Joining me today is a top corporate honcho, Koushik Chatterjee, Group Executive Director, Finance and Corporate at Tata Steel, and Dr. Kavita Rao, Professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, the apex fiscal policy advisory body for the government. Well, in a bit, we will also be joined by Haseeb, Drabu, the well-known economist and Finance Minister of J&K. But first, let me welcome Koushik and Kavita. Thank you very much for joining me. Well, first up, Koushik, this budget also comes in the wake of the Finance Minister having promised grandfathering or phasing out of exemptions and reduction of taxes. All the exemptions haven't been phased out, so is it legitimate to expect tax cuts?
So I think it is reasonable to expect that the exemptions should come down and should be eliminated if we have to move towards a lower rate of taxation in India, which is expected to enhance both compliance and widen the tax base. I would only request the Finance Minister, if there are some exemptions which should have a longer transition life, for example, investments into the R&D and innovations, because as a country we need a more competitive positioning as far as R&D is concerned. We are a country which is going to grow. We have a huge population, and therefore the consumptions will increase. And therefore Indian companies must take on the R&D path as a critical business objective, and therefore incentives which are already in place should be extended for a longer period of time. The second one is our incentives like on climate change. So there were exemptions which were given for machinery and equipments which was targeted towards reducing pollution. And if India is to achieve its climate targets as a signatory to the COP21 last year, then I think it is important for companies to aggressively invest in climate-related equipments, and therefore they should be incentivized to make those investments. And therefore these are the two that comes to my mind as needs a timeline rather than be abrupt in stopping those incentives in the future. Other than that,
please go ahead.
A gradual or even a systematic elimination is fine.
Okay. Well, let me get Kavita in. Kavita, is there a case, even keeping these exemptions in mind, is there a case for corporate tax cuts? There are a bunch of economists who argue that India is actually among the lesser taxed countries compared to comparable economies and more developed economies.
There is always a case for tax cut, I presume. The story that, however, I like to tell or I like to see is when you do a tax cut, there are a large number of companies which are paying higher rates who will be paying lower rates now. And there is an equally large number who are paying substantially lower rates who wouldn't be happier paying a 25%. So it's not an easy sell, although on paper it looks like a good decision to phase out exemptions and to bring in a lower rate. It's in terms of the actual dynamics of how who is affected, I don't think it's an easy sell, but it makes a lot of sense to try to phase out exemptions because like Koushik just argued, there is a case for this exemption and there's a case for that exemption, but I don't know why we consistently believe taxes are the only place where government should be incentivizing behavior. And once we hold on to that line of thought, there is always a case for one more exemption and one more exemption. So if we can clean up the ground by bringing the rates a little lower and cleaning it up altogether, I think that's a smart thing to do.
Okay. Well, the other question really is whether the economy desperately needs stimulus, and has the government been very successful in stimulating so far? Koushik, that question to you.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you really look at the Indian economy relative to the rest of the world, we would certainly say that we are doing extremely well. But that we can say we've been doing well in the last few years, and in fact, post the global financial crisis, India has weathered it better than most other developing economies, and indeed the developed economies. So I think that's not the question. I think it is whether India is performing to its potential. And if you need to grow at a much higher rate, if the aspiration is to grow at about 8%, 9%, then we need momentum of investments which will generate a significant amount of economic value for the country. And it has to be investment-led, it has to be employment-led, and then consumption-led. So I think people are all searching for that big breakaway phase of investments where both private capital and public capital or government spending will go hand in hand and create that economic phase where the country will employ more people, will throw up more consumption surplus, people will spend more, and that's the kickstart people are looking for. And I think that's been the expectation for the last couple of years.
Okay.
So we've been seeing a fair amount of public spending, but we've not seen private capital being put onto the ground. And the other aspect is there are some sectors of the economy where there is significant amount of capacity which is impacted by financial constraints or oversupply and things like that, or even regulatory issues, which is latent, and people are waiting for policy changes and demand kickers coming in so that capacity can be put to productive use. So I think it's a combination or a balance. It's not so much of a stimulus as such, but I think it's the objective of performing to our potential. And often budget announcements take 1 year, 1.5 years to actually fructify. As you rightly said, that there are issues on the ground which needs to be overcome. But if the policy direction is on that, on an investment focused growth, then I think rather than consumption focused growth, then I think we will be on a much more solid pedestal than the rest of the world. And I think that is what we need to do, because we have manufacturing competitiveness across many sectors. And we just need to ensure that those investments flow in and make India a more competitive nation.
Okay. Well, I take your point that budget is just one day and one policy effort, and it should be a daily effort to reduce cost of doing business. But Kavita, two questions for you. One, should it be investment-led or consumption-led stimulus that the government should think of?
I personally believe that if you're looking at an economy where investment is slowed down and where excess capacities are being talked about, and demonetization has done its bit to make sure that there's an income compression which will further lead to consumption compression, then you should be looking at a consumption-led stimulus rather than an investment-led stimulus, because investment-led stimulus is a long cycle which takes a while to get translated into actual growth numbers and employment numbers. So I believe at the moment, if you're looking at a stimulus, you're looking more at a consumption stimulus. Not to forget that we have a budget, we have an election, a grand election in 2 years' time. So if you're looking at 6 years to try to turn around the growth in the economy, I don't think that is the time frame that any government really has.
Okay. Fine. Well, the other question I wanted to ask you as an economist is the fiscal deficit timetable. Logically, the coming year should see a 3% deficit. would you be okay if, that is not reached? Would you be okay if even the direction changed and the government went ahead with, say, 3.6 or 3.7% deficit in the current year, simply because it believes a stimulus is needed?
Actually, whether 3.5 or 3.6% is good or bad, I personally have little difficulty with looking at a higher deficit figure if we believe the economy is slowing down. But for that, it is important for the government to recognize and to accept that the economy is slowing down, which so far the government has not been accepting.
Okay.
So the government's position so far has been the economy is coasting along quite fine. Demonetization has not had an impact on the economy, and so there's no serious case to say that we should actually stimulate the economy.
Okay.
I believe that we need to stimulate the economy. The government doesn't seem to hold the same argument. So given their position so far, it is difficult for the government to say, but now I want to stimulate the economy.
Okay. Well, that will be
that is a contradiction.
I take your point, but if we were to remove this political noise and only ask you as an economist, what would your thematic advice be to the government?
I would think that if you want to see more robust growth, now is a good time to relax your deficit constraint a little bit and spend on consumption, not on investment.
All right. Take your point. Kavita and Koushik, thank you very much for joining me in this very interesting conversation. In a bit, we will be joined by the Finance Minister of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And let's see what the state's view on mapping the stimulus is.